The first thing I heard when I opened the front door of my own $6.2 million house was my grandmother whispering, "I am so sorry, ma'am. I will clean my blood off the floor." Her voice drifted from the marble hallway, thin and shaking, almost drowned by a television shouting in the next room. Bleach and floor cleaners stung my nose. I had just spent 9 months breathing jet fuel and desert dust. This smell made my stomach twist. I dropped my duffel and turned the corner. Grandma Evelyn was on her knees on the cold stone, one hand braced on the tile, the other scrubbing a dark red smear with a rag that used to be one of my father's shirts. Fresh gauze wrapped her wrist. Her bare feet were flat on the wet marble. "Grandma," I said. Before she could look up, a damp cloth flew past my leg and landed by her knees. "Pick it up," Tyler said behind me. "You spilled it, you clean it." His voice had the same lazy mockery it had when we were kids, now coming from a grown man leaning in the doorway with a glass of wine in his hand. "Soldier girl is not going to help you." She just drops in, takes a few pictures in uniform, then disappears again. Do not expect her to bend down. I turned. Tyler stood in clean socks on the same floor my grandmother was scrubbing. Behind him, the television flashed over the leather sofa where my Aunt Linda sat in leggings and an old sweatshirt, a bottle of wine on the table. Linda finally looked up and let her eyes travel from my dusty boots to my plain green army tee to the unit patch on my duffel by the door, the small symbol that meant Joint Task Force to the few who knew. "Oh, look who remembered this address," she said, smiling without warmth. "Back from wherever. Your grandmother has a roof and a bed. That is already generous. Let us not make a scene." This glass box above Boulder, with the view of the Rockies, was the house my parents bought after they sold their first company. The house they walked me through at 17 and said, "One day, this will be yours." After the accident, I sat in a lawyer's office at 20 and signed the deed with a shaking hand. My name is on that paper. Yet Linda said, generous, like my grandmother, should be grateful not to sleep on the porch. "It was my fault," Grandma blurted, staring at Linda instead of at me. "I tripped. I am clumsy. I will finish the floor and then start supper. Maybe I can still make that roast." "You are not finishing anything," I said. And that was when I saw the pale yellow bruises along the inside of her forearm, just visible under her cuff. Not one fall, not one accident. Too much work on a 78-year-old body. "She lives here for free, she can mop," Tyler said. "Out there." He waved his glass toward the windows and the dark line of the mountains. "Maybe people salute you and bring you coffee. In this house, the person who pays the bills decides who does what. That would be us." Linda raised her glass in a lazy toast and turned the volume up as a sports crowd roared. In my chest, something went very still. An hour earlier, I sat in a rental car at the bottom of this driveway, ending a call with a general who insisted on using my first name and said, "When you are finally done saving everybody else, we can move you straight to D.C. 10 minutes earlier, my secure email pinged with a briefing request from Army G2 about an operation I helped design. Inside this doorway, none of that mattered. In here, I was just the girl who left. I watched my grandmother shift her knees on the wet floor and wince, her hand shaking as she reached for the rag Tyler had thrown. I stepped forward, picked it up first, set it on the counter and said, "I will take care of it." "Sim down. That is cute," Linda said with a soft laugh. "You fly in for a weekend and think you are going to run this place? We kept this house standing while you were off playing hero. You want your grandmother to have a room here? You do not walk in and start barking orders." My fingers curled into my palms until my joints ached. In the last year, I had watched live feeds go gray and come back, and known the difference between those two frames was a convoy of soldiers making it home. I knew exactly who built this house and who actually paid these taxes. None of that changed the picture in front of me. My grandmother, barefoot on a wet floor, apologizing for bleeding on stone I used to slide across in socks when I was 9. Tyler set his glass down hard. "Maybe say thank you before you start critiquing the help," he said. I looked at him. I looked at Linda. I looked at the woman who held me when my father died and sat through my basic training graduation in the rain. She should have been in her favorite chair by the window with a blanket and a crossword, not on her hands and knees like staff. "Say something," a raw part of me screamed. "Throw them out. Wave the deed in their faces." Instead, I did what years of Army intelligence has taught me to do when something is very wrong. I watched. I watched the way Grandma flinched when Linda shifted on the sofa, the way her eyes flicked to Linda before she tried to sit. That tiny glance, cutting deeper than the insults, because it told me exactly who she believed controlled whether she sat or knelt. "Grandma, sit down," I said again, quieter. "Please." She froze for a heartbeat, then slowly obeyed and lowered herself onto the edge of a chair as if she might be punished for it. If you have ever watched someone you love be treated like a servant in a home they helped build, you know the sound your heart makes when it breaks is not loud. It is a quiet tear under the ribs. I heard it. Right after that, I heard the calm voice that shows up in my head when a mission shifts. "This is not just rude family, Captain," it said. "This is hostile ground, and you know how to handle hostile ground." Before I tell you what I did next, and how far Linda and Tyler were willing to go to keep their hands on a house that was never theirs, I want you to think about the oldest person in your family, the one who held everything together when everyone else fell apart. If you have ever seen someone like that, treated like staff in their own kitchen, tell me what city you are watching from. I read every comment. The people in this room had no idea what I had just done for my country. They also had no idea what I could do with this house. They were about to find out. Sitting in my rental car at the edge of the long, curved driveway that led to the glass house above Boulder, I let the engine tick into silence and felt the weight of the evening settle on my shoulders. The house glowed softly behind the pines, as if nothing inside it had been damaged or twisted or taken. I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, remembering a time when I was small enough to run through that same driveway barefoot, without a single worry in my chest. I could still see the garden that wrapped around the western side of the property, where my grandmother Evelyn and I planted peonies each spring. I would dig uneven holes, and she would gently fix them when she thought I was not looking. My parents would step out onto the deck above us, laughing about something they were building or fixing in their startup world, while Linda stood farther back in the shade, her arms crossed and her face pinched, as though our happiness cost her something. In those childhood summers, the world felt simple. My father used to point toward the Rockies and say, "This view means you made it in America." And he meant it, because the house was their symbol of success after years of hard work in technology and real estate combined. My mother called it their American dream, and they believed this home would carry forward to me one day. That message sank deep, even before I understood how money and property shape families. My grandmother was the anchor of all of it, the one who kept me steady when programs changed or schools shifted, or when I felt invisible next to adults with bigger voices. She taught me responsibility, gently, without judgment. Linda, on the other hand, existed in a constant cloud of resentment. She had lost money in one bad venture after another, and whenever my mother tried to help, she acted as though the world owed her something. Her son Tyler grew up absorbing those complaints, until he carried himself like everyone around him existed to fix his frustrations. Even as a child, I recognized Linda felt overshadowed by my mother, the successful sister, who made clear plans for her only child. Years later, I would understand how dangerous that bitterness could become. But at 18, I just felt vaguely uncomfortable when she visited. The first real sign of the fracture came the night before I left for basic training. It was supposed to be a celebratory dinner. My mother cooked my favorite roast, and my father gave a short toast about service and integrity. My grandmother cried softly in pride. Then Linda leaned back in her chair and said loudly enough for the table to hear, "Someone chooses the military when no decent college wants them, right?" There was a long, stiff silence. My father said nothing because he knew arguing with her never helped, and my mother shot her a warning look. I only smiled politely because that was how I coped back then. My grandmother squeezed my hand under the table and whispered, "Ignore her, Jade. Your path is your own." I kept her voice in my mind through the next months, when I earned my ROTC scholarship and began building something meaningful. During one of my early years in training, I contributed to a data-driven analysis that helped guide a hostage recovery mission. I never bragged, and my family never fully grasped the significance, but I sensed Linda saw the recognition my commander gave me and felt threatened by it. She muttered comments about office soldiers and low pay, even though she had never shown the discipline to follow through with any career. My parents, however, understood every achievement and quietly supported my growth. The day they told me that this house would pass to me when I was ready, I felt a responsibility settle into my bones. Linda overheard the conversation, and her face tightened in a way that lingered with me even after she left the room. Months later, while I was in the middle of a training rotation, a call came during a snowstorm. A state trooper delivered the news quickly and clinically. My parents had died in a car accident on icy roads outside Golden. I remember sitting on my bunk, staring at the cinder block wall while the wind outside screamed against the windows. Everything blurred together after that. I flew home, I met with lawyers, I signed documents with trembling hands. My grandmother held me so tightly, I thought her arms might break. Linda inserted herself into the logistical aftermath, offering to handle papers while I finished my training cycle. In my grief, I did not question her involvement. The deed and accounts were formally placed in my name, but a number of items were left in temporary management by people I barely recognized because I was too numb to fight. At the funeral service, my uniform felt too new and too stiff, but my grandmother smiled at me with such pride that I held her hand through the entire ceremony. That was when a senior officer approached an imposing man with silver hair whose presence made people step aside. He shook my hand firmly and said, "When you are ready, consider moving into a joint command. You have the instincts for it." I nodded, unable to speak. I noticed Linda watching us from a few feet away, whispering to a neighbor, "He is just being polite. They say that to everyone." She dismissed the moment entirely, not knowing that endorsement would later define the trajectory of my life. I learned to stay quiet, to observe, to remember every slight. These small seeds of disrespect would grow into the full toxic maze I walked into tonight. But back then, at the edge of that graveyard, I simply stood between my grandmother and the bitter woman who would eventually try to rewrite the boundaries of a house that never belonged to her. As I sat in the car now staring at that same house glowing against the mountain backdrop, I felt the years of small slights tighten into a single, clear understanding. The toxicity had been there all along, waiting for the moment when I was most exhausted, most alone, and least likely to push back. They assumed I would stay silent forever. They were wrong. The hum of generators and the low vibration of distant aircraft pressed against the walls of the war room at Al Udeid, as I stood before a bank of monitors showing overlapping drone feeds and satellite overlays. The screen nearest me displayed a heat map creeping toward a convoy route where 2 American supply vehicles were scheduled to pass within the hour. I scanned the data stream, then spoke clearly to the colonel who stood beside me. The pattern is not random. If they shift north by 4 clicks, they will intersect a probable ambush corridor. Recommend immediate reroute through the secondary valley. The colonel studied the feed for a moment, then nodded with the certainty of someone who trusted my judgment. "Do it," he said. "Adjust the order." Within minutes, the convoy altered course. The tension in the room eased just slightly, and a lieutenant murmured, "Good catch, Captain." I did not answer. My eyes stayed fixed on the screen, watching until the last vehicle cleared the danger zone. In my ear, my secure headset clicked with a brief encrypted message from JSOC, confirming that their parallel overwatch agreed with my assessment. It was the kind of coordination few officers my age were allowed to touch. My TSCI clearance placed me in rooms where decisions meant life or death, and where generals addressed me as though I had already proven myself for a decade. A week earlier, I had been on a secure video link with a 2-star general who greeted me with a calm, "Hello, Jade," and proceeded to discuss a cross-command operation, the way old colleagues do. If Linda or Tyler had ever glimpsed a moment of that call, they would have assumed I was watching television instead of briefing a man whose orders shaped entire regions. During the brief pause between missions, I stepped outside into the blast of desert heat, pulled my phone from my pocket, and checked messages. The first was from Linda. "Property taxes went up again this year. Can you send more?" That tone always assumed compliance, never gratitude. I transferred the money automatically and closed the banking app without resentment because I believed every dollar helped my grandmother stay safe and cared for. Another message blinked at the bottom of the screen. A missed video call from Grandma. I hit redial, but the call connected only long enough for her face to appear in a grainy frame before Linda's voice said, "The Wi-Fi is terrible today," and the screen went black. Just before the call cut out, I saw the edge of a brand new 4K television behind her, glowing in crisp resolution, far from the blurry feed I had grown used to. I stood in the sun, staring at the reflection of my own dusty uniform, wondering how a house that once felt warm now had shadows at every corner. My phone buzzed again, a short message from Linda. "If you can swing by for 2 weeks, do it later. No need to come now. We are handling everything at home." The phrasing struck me. Handling. As if the home was theirs to manage. Each time she said house, it sounded less like the place my parents had built for me, and more like territory she had claimed, through presence and persistence. Back inside the war room, I returned to the glowing screens. A blinking file requested immediate review, and I dove back into work, because duty did not pause for personal unease. My analysis that afternoon contributed to the identification of a weapons cache hidden beneath a decoy structure. The colonel later pulled me aside. "You have a way of seeing patterns others miss. Consider staying with joint operations longer. There is a path here for you." His confidence warmed me briefly, but the moment I walked back to my quarters, the heaviness returned. I checked my messages again. Nothing from Grandma. Weeks passed in a rhythm of heat maps, satellite loops, and briefings that ran long into the night. During one short rotation break, I asked about taking a 2-week leave. Before my request even processed, my phone lit with another message from Linda. "Do not worry about coming. Your grandmother is fine. You should focus on your missions. The house is under control." The house. Not our house. Not your home. The house. That subtle shift of language lodged in my chest like a splinter. I kept sending money. The refrigerator repair, the landscaping, a plumbing update. All of it billed to me with the silent expectation of obedience. In the midst of one late-night operation, I caught my reflection in the dim glass of a monitor. A soldier trusted to protect hundreds, but apparently powerless to protect one elderly woman who had raised her. The absurdity stung, but I said nothing. Silence was easier in uniform than vulnerability. Then one morning, as the sun rose over the base, flooding the tents with blinding gold, my phone buzzed faintly. It was a single message from Grandma, sent at a strange hour. "I miss you. Our home does not feel like your home anymore." I stared at the words so long, the screen dimmed. For the first time in months, I asked my commander directly about leave, and he looked genuinely regretful as he slid a new mission folder toward me. "I need you on this. Your signature is required. Timing is tight." I held the folder in my hands, feeling the weight of responsibility closing around me again. I thought of Grandma, writing from a room that should have been hers, and of the distance I felt widening hour by hour because I had chosen duty. By the time I stepped back into the war room, the decision was already made for me. I signed the acceptance line and returned to the task of protecting strangers half a world away, while the one person who needed me most slipped further out of reach. The flight into Denver cut across a hard blue sky, and the Rockies rose up like a wall under the wing. I sat by the window and tried to replace mission maps in my head with one simple picture: my grandmother at the stove in this house. The man in the aisle seat glanced at my uniform and asked what I did. "Army," I said. "Nothing more." The rideshare turned onto our road in Boulder, and the first thing I saw was the mailbox. The name Lockridge had been scraped off, ghost letters still faint in the metal. In its place, a shiny decal in curling script read, "The Stewart family." I got out with my duffel and stared at the front of the house that, by Chuk and by law, was mine. A smart doorbell camera now framed the door, its ring glowing. Under the handle sat a new keypad lock. Out of habit, I tried the knob. It did not move. The keypad blinked, waiting for a code I did not have. For the first time in my life here, I had to press a button and wait to be admitted. The chime rang inside. The lens tilted, focusing on my face, and the door opened just far enough for Linda to stand in the gap. She wore leggings and an expensive sweater, hair perfect, expression flat. "You did not tell us you were coming," she said. "We have plans. Grandma is in the middle of things." Plans. As if my coming home was an interruption to their schedule. I shifted my duffel. "I just want to see her," I said. Before she could answer, Tyler stepped into the doorway, bigger now, shoulders filling the frame. "Grandma is busy in the kitchen," he said. "She has chores." Soldiers probably get used to having people serve them, but this is not a base. The way he said "soldiers" carried more contempt than curiosity. I felt my jaw tighten, but my voice stayed level. "I just want to say hi. It has been a long time." Linda sighed as if I had already started trouble and moved aside a few inches. "Fine. Just do not start anything." She hates drama. We finally have a good routine going. I stepped into the foyer and felt the air change. The walls where my parents' pictures used to hang now held large abstract paintings. In the living room, a new couch faced a huge television. Glass shelves held rows of whiskey and wine. Then I reached the kitchen, and the contrast hit harder than anything Tyler had said. The same worn cabinets, the same old stove with the missing knob, the same chipped plates drying in a cheap rack. And on the cold tile floor, barefoot, stood my grandmother in a faded house dress and apron, shoulders hunched. When she turned and saw me, her face opened with pure joy for half a second, then closed down just as fast as her eyes slid toward the doorway. "Jade," she breathed, my name wrapped in apology. Tyler walked in with a folded piece of paper in his hand. He let it fall so it landed at her feet. "You are not done," he said, loud and casual. List is still full. You eat when you finish. Do not use having company as an excuse to skip out. My grandmother bent slowly to pick up the paper, fingers shaking. Sorry, she murmured, as if the problem was hers. I felt my fingers curl into a fist until the knuckles went white. There is no reason to talk to her like that, I said. Tyler shrugged, eyes already back on his phone. She likes having structure. Keeps her sharp. Linda leaned against a new bar built along the edge of the room, bottles lined up behind her. Jade, you would not believe how much work it is to keep this place going, she said. Taxes, repairs, everything. Grandma insists on helping. It makes her feel useful. She smiled, but it did not touch her eyes. I let my training take over and simply observed. New furniture, upgraded electronics, all of it clearly for them. Old stove, old dishes, a barefoot 78-year-old woman carrying the load of the house. At dinner, my grandmother barely sat. She got up to refill glasses, clear plates, wipe spills, apologizing every time Tyler snapped his fingers or Linda pointed at something. Anytime I stood to help, Linda waved me down with a look. We have a system, she said. Later, in my old room, I lay on the bed that did not feel like mine anymore. The posters were gone, replaced by neutral art. Through the walls, I heard the low buzz of Linda's television and Tyler's laugh. When the noises finally faded, I slipped into the hallway. A strip of light showed under my grandmother's door. I tapped softly. It is me, I said. Can I come in? The door opened, and she stood there, small and tired. Come in, honey, she whispered, and sat back on the edge of the bed. Her slippers were pushed aside. On the nightstand sat a discount bottle of pain reliever. For a few seconds, we just sat in silence. Then she reached under her pillow, drew out a small plastic bag with loose pills, and with shaking hands tucked it into the top drawer of the nightstand and slid it shut. Do not tell Linda, she murmured. If she thinks I am using too many, she cuts me off. Says I am wasteful. So I take a few and hide them. Just enough to get through the bad days. She said it like she was explaining a house rule. I looked at the cheap bottle, at the drawer, at the faint bruise peeking out from under her sleeve, and felt the earlier anger settle into something colder. They had taken the walls and the mailbox and the name off the front. Now they were deciding when she had earned the right not to hurt. Coming on that bed in the house that was legally mine, listening to her whisper, I stopped wondering if I was overreacting. I knew exactly what I was looking at, and I knew this time I would not let it slide. I woke before the sun, the kind of instinctive wakefulness that comes from years of deployment. The house was silent except for the heater kicking on and the faint creak of pipes. I sat at the small desk in my childhood room and opened my laptop. A folder named Estate waited where I had left it years ago after the funeral. I clicked through scanned PDFs, signatures I barely remembered writing, and the original will my parents had drafted long before any of this chaos. Line after line confirmed what I already knew but had never paused long enough to confront. The house, valued then at $6.2 million in Boulder, would transfer fully to me the moment I turned 25. Linda was listed only as a temporary trustee, with a stated period of 2 years following my parents' passing. I was 28 now. Her role had expired 3 years ago. Yet 2 days earlier, I had been standing on the porch of a home I supposedly owned and ringing a doorbell like a stranger. When I checked the most recent emails, there was one from someone calling himself the family attorney. The message insisted the property had been placed into a new structure, referenced vaguely as a family trust. He recommended I sign attached forms to streamline management responsibilities. I scrolled to his signature block. The name was not the estate lawyer who handled the will. It was someone completely different, Someone Linda must have hired on her own. I leaned back and let the implications settle. She had overridden the will and continued to present herself as the rightful decision-maker, even after her authority had expired. She had done it quietly enough that from abroad it had looked like simple housekeeping. Outside the window, the neighborhood began to wake. Lights flicked on, a dog barked, a sprinkler hissed. I remembered the way neighbors had looked at me last night when I stepped out of the rideshare. Polite but distant, surprised but not warm. It struck me now why. Linda had been telling them her version of events. I heard it perfectly in her voice. Jade ran off to the army. Someone had to take responsibility for this place. If I had not stepped in, the bank would have taken the house and poor Evelyn would be homeless. She crafted narratives like she crafted everything else in this house, meticulously, but dishonestly. In their eyes, I must have looked like the granddaughter who visited only when convenient, who sent money instead of love, who returned only when the house became valuable enough to claim. I closed the laptop and walked to the kitchen, where Linda was pouring herself coffee. The scent of an expensive roast filled the room. I asked her where the documents were. She did not look up. What documents? The house documents, I said. The trust paperwork. Anything you made Grandma sign. She shrugged. If I had not signed things on her behalf, we would have lost the place. Taxes went up. Repairs. You would not understand. You are never here. My grandmother, drying a pan at the sink, froze. Linda continued before I could respond. Adults have to make difficult choices, she said. Not everything is a military briefing. I held her gaze. Grandma signed things without knowing what they were. Why? Linda set her mug down. Because she trusts me. And because you were too busy to handle it from your secret locations. My grandmother turned slowly, and her voice trembled. She told me it was a paper to make sure you did not lose the house, she said softly. That is what your aunt told me. For a long moment, the room stayed quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I thought of my parents promising me the house at 18, their voices warm with pride. I thought of the will. I thought of me at 28, standing in a kitchen where money I had sent for Grandma's comfort had gone into a marble bar counter and artisan coffee. A vibration buzzed from the counter. Linda's phone lit up with a payment notification that did not match anything essential. A cosmetic clinic. When I opened the fridge for water, my eyes caught another detail. A dealership keychain on the desk with a logo from a luxury car brand. My grandmother sat driving nothing but worry. Linda was charging her credit card, her only remaining lifeline. Across the kitchen, Tyler walked in, grinning at his phone. Dude, our place is insane now, he said to someone on speaker. Soon to be mine, anyway. Grandma will not need a mansion forever. He winked at me like he expected me to laugh. Instead, something sharpened inside me. After he stepped out to take his call outside, Linda leaned on the island, eyes cool. He is young, she said. He does not mean anything. I did not answer. I was thinking about signatures, dates, tax statements, power of attorney forms Linda had no right to obtain. I felt my pulse settle into the kind of steady rhythm I recognized from mission planning. Anger became clarity. I went back to my room with purpose. The laptop was still open on the email from the supposed family attorney. Under it sat an unread message whose sender I recognized instantly. A JAG major who had been in my training cohort years ago. His subject line was short. Checking in. Under it, his message read, If they made your grandmother sign anything she did not understand, this could be serious elder exploitation. Send me everything you have. The words hit like a quiet switch flipping on. For the first time since returning to Boulder, I felt a sense of ground beneath my feet. My life had always had two worlds: the one these people saw, quiet soldier girl who sent money, and the one built on classified briefings, meticulous intelligence analysis, and systems that punished exploitation, no matter who did it. I stared at the screen, at his signature block, and felt the room narrow into focus. They had misjudged me because they had only ever seen what they wanted to see. Now I knew where the real battlefield was. I closed the email from the JAG major and let the room settle into silence. The decision came easily. I reached for my rucksack the same way I had done 1,000 times in deployed environments and unzipped the inner compartment. Inside was a compact kit of mini cameras and audio nodes, equipment I had used during training cycles and exercises, where intelligence gathering was the only way to map out threats before they created casualties. At home, no one had ever asked what I carried. Linda had once joked that my gear all looked like tech toys. Tyler had called it nerd stuff. They had no idea what any of it could do once activated. I laid the devices out on the desk and tested each one with the same calm precision I used overseas. Battery check, signal test, encryption key. Everything responded perfectly. The house outside my room was alive with the dull morning rhythm of Linda's footsteps and the clinking of dishes as my grandmother tried to keep up with whatever task had been assigned to her. I walked out casually, placing the first camera on a shelf in the living room. It blended into the row of decorative objects Linda had bought using money from the card under Grandma's name. The second went above the kitchen cabinets angled toward the floor, where most of the labor took place. The third I placed in the hallway outside the bedrooms. None were noticeable unless someone intentionally searched for them. By the time Linda left for a grocery run and Tyler disappeared into the basement to play games, I had the entire downstairs area mapped visually. When I stepped outside for what I announced as a morning run, I checked my military phone. The feed synced smoothly. 3 screens lit up, showing a quiet house waiting to reveal its truth. I jogged only far enough to make the routine believable, then doubled back to sit at the edge of the driveway where I could review the footage in real time. It did not take long for the first act of cruelty to unfold. In the kitchen, my grandmother stood at the sink, taking her morning medication with a glass of water. Her hands trembled from yesterday's chores. Linda walked in, saw a single pill on the counter, and immediately snapped at her. "If you spill anything, you clean it up. I am not your nurse." Grandma nodded and reached for a rag. She had not dropped anything yet. Linda shoved a mop into her hands and pointed at a section of floor that was already spotless. "Work first, then eat. You living here costs money. Jade is not around to see the bills." The words hit sharper than the tone. I watched as my grandmother bent down and began to scrub the same tile again and again while Linda scrolled her phone. A moment later, Tyler walked through holding his own plate of food. He paused only long enough to take a picture of her crouched posture. "Our free maid," he said as he typed something into his phone and laughed before walking away. I felt the familiar burn of anger rise behind my ribs, but I forced it down with the same discipline I used during operations. Emotion clouded sequencing, and sequencing mattered now more than anything. My mind shifted to analytical mode. Identify targets, define patterns, establish timelines, map financial flows, build a case file. This was not the deeply chaotic environment of a foreign AO, but in a way, it felt more volatile because it was my home, the one place that should have been free of this. The footage continued to scroll. Each moment layered insult upon insult. Linda lectured Grandma about using too much electricity. She criticized her for breathing loudly. She told her that Jade being in the army meant she did not understand real-life costs. Every clip added weight to the file I was building in my head. I opened a new document on my phone and titled it Operation Homefront. Under it, I began logging incidents with timestamps pulled directly from the feed. Abuse, verbal, one instance. Forced labor, multiple. Financial red flags, ongoing. I added notes about the new TV, the cosmetic clinic charge, the luxury car keychain, the narrative Linda had crafted for neighbors. This was not a spur-of-the-moment power grab, but a long, systematic pattern of exploitation that had grown unchecked because no one had ever challenged her. My grandmother was the most vulnerable, and therefore, the easiest to manipulate. I leaned back against the hood of my car and let the winter air cool the tension in my jaw. This was my AO now. I had fought in harsher places than Boulder, Colorado. The difference was that on deployment, I expected hostility. Here, I had wanted peace and found betrayal. That realization hurt more than any mission wound. Later in the afternoon, I returned inside, pretending to look for a snack. I grabbed a glass from the cabinet below the camera and casually checked the angles. Everything was recording perfectly. My grandmother passed behind me carrying laundry heavier than she should ever have lifted. Linda stood in the doorway criticizing her pace. "Move faster, Mom. You are not old enough to act helpless." I stepped aside because revealing my anger too early would compromise everything I was building. As I returned to my room, my phone buzzed. A notification from the hallway camera showed Linda on a call pacing aggressively. I turned on the audio feed. Her voice sliced through the static. "If she finds out the house is under the new trust, she will lose her mind. But she is too busy being a hero somewhere. She will not bother reading anything." I watched her curl her lip as she listened to whoever was on the other end. She thinks coming home makes her important. She has no idea how things work here. I let the recording continue until she ended the call. The house fell silent again. I saved the audio file directly into Operation Homefront. For a moment, I stared at the waveform on the screen. Then, under my breath, so softly that even the camera did not pick it up, I said exactly what the outline of this moment required. "You are right, Linda. I have been busy being a hero. Now, it is time to be something else in this house." The morning after I named my case file Operation Homefront, I put on my dress uniform and drove into downtown Boulder. The elder law office the JAG major had recommended sat over a coffee shop near Pearl Street. Narrow hallway, glass door, metal filing cabinets stacked to the ceiling. When I stepped inside, the attorney, a woman in a navy blazer whose nameplate read Karen Holt, stood to shake my hand. "Captain Lockridge," she said. "Please sit. Show me what you have." I opened my laptop and pulled up the folder labeled Estate that had lived on my hard drive since the week my parents died. I slid the original copy of their will across her desk, the one that said the house went to me at 25, and named Linda as trustee for only 2 years. Then I showed her the emails from the so-called family attorney Linda had hired about moving everything into a new family trust. Last, I unlocked my military phone and let a still frame from the kitchen camera fill the screen. My grandmother bent over a bucket, Linda standing with her arms crossed, Tyler holding his own phone up, laughing. Karen watched one clip after another, my grandmother scrubbing the floor right after swallowing a pill, Tyler bumping a laundry basket into her chest, Linda saying, "If you live here, you work. Jade does not pay the bills." Then she turned back to the will and the list of bank transactions I had exported, each charge made on a card in my grandmother's name. A cosmetic clinic, a car dealership, high-end groceries nowhere near the discount pharmacy where my grandmother bought her cheap pain pills. "All right," she said finally. "Here is what we can do. We can petition the court for a temporary order to protect your grandmother so she is not left alone with them while we sort this out. We can ask a judge to confirm that title to the house follows the original will, because this trustee period is clearly over. And based on these charges and on the way they are controlling her medication, we can and probably should bring in adult protective services and if needed, the district attorney for possible elder financial exploitation. Hearing my family described in those terms made my stomach lurch, but it also felt like putting coordinates onto a map. There were rules here, not just hurt feelings. Karen told me she would draft the petitions, but she needed fresh eyes in the house, not only my cameras. That was where APS came in. 2 days later, a gray state sedan pulled into the driveway. A woman with a laminated badge and a clipboard walked up to the door. Linda had done her hair and makeup that morning like it was Sunday service. When my grandmother opened the door, the worker introduced herself and said she was there to check on senior well-being. "Oh, we are so grateful," Linda said quickly, sliding an arm around my grandmother's shoulders. "Mom insists on doing everything. She loves to stay active." The worker walked through the bright living room and the polished kitchen while Linda kept talking. "Mom can be forgetful with her pills, so we do not let her manage them alone, for her own safety. She likes to keep busy with chores. It gives her purpose." She even threw in a line about my service. "Jade has been overseas keeping us safe, so we try not to bother her with little things here at home." The worker asked to speak to my grandmother alone in the dining room. "Do you feel safe here, Mrs. Evelyn?" she asked gently. My grandmother hesitated, then said, "Yes." I could see the fear in her eyes. She did not know what would happen if she said no. The visit ended with polite handshakes. Linda closed the door and let out a satisfied little laugh. "See," she said, "even the state thinks we are doing fine." That afternoon, I sat in my car down the street and joined a secure video call with the same APS worker. This time, it was my screen she watched. I shared the footage from Operation Homefront. Linda cutting off medication because my grandmother complained too much. Tyler taking a photo of her bent under a pile of laundry and texting our free maid to someone I could not see. Linda saying on the phone, if she finds out about the new trust, she will lose her mind. But she is too busy being a hero to look it up. The worker did not write anything now. When the last clip ended, she sat very still. "This is very different from what I saw in person," she said. I nodded. "People behave well for clipboards," I answered. "I am used to folks hiding their worst when they think the camera is off." She asked how I knew the reporting process so precisely, which offices to contact, what kind of documentation they would take seriously. I kept my answer short. In my last assignment, we had training on protecting vulnerable people in unstable environments, I said. My job was to track patterns and make sure the right authorities had what they needed. I did not add that the training manual she was thinking of existed because my section built it, and I wrote half the brief. APS agreed to reopen the case and coordinate with Karen. When I met my lawyer again, she had already spoken with the worker. The cautious tone was gone. "We have enough to move," Karen told me. "But I do not just want filings. I want Linda to show a judge who she really is. Judges like seeing how someone talks when they think they are still in control." She laid out the plan. We would invite Linda to what sounded like a simple family discussion about the future of the house and my grandmother's care. The invitation would make her feel like the decision-maker. Karen would attend as my counsel. The APS worker could be there as an observer. With everyone's consent, we could record the conversation. If Linda pressured my grandmother or misrepresented the will, it would not be my word against hers. It would be her own performance in a setting the court understood. That meeting would be our public exposure moment, not a shouting match on the front lawn, but a living room table where the balance of power quietly flipped. Walking out of the office into the cold light off the Rockies, I realized how familiar the setup felt. Quiet room, limited group, one conversation that would change the next phase of an operation. Only this time, the operation was my grandmother's life. On the drive back to the house, I called Linda and put the phone on speaker, listening to my own voice stay calm. "Mom, we need to sit down and see how I can help the family and the house," I said. There was a beat of silence, and then she brightened. "I knew you would come around," she answered. "We can talk about what is fair for everyone." She heard surrender. I heard an opening. If you have ever watched a so-called family meeting change everything in a house, tell me what city you are watching from. Because some of the biggest battles are fought at the smallest tables. Saturday afternoon arrived colder than the forecast had promised. The light over the Rockies slid into the living room just enough to hit the stack of documents Karen and I had placed neatly on the coffee table. To Linda, they looked like transfer papers, maybe loan documents, maybe something proving she was about to gain more control. She had spent the whole morning humming as she wiped down surfaces she normally left for my grandmother. Now she sat proudly at the head of the table in a blouse she reserved for church. Tyler lounged at her side, arms crossed, shoes propped where he knew they did not belong. I came down the stairs in simple jeans and a soft sweater. No uniform, no insignia. Nothing that reminded them of the world in which they had mocked me for years. Linda clocked it immediately. "I knew you would come to your senses," she said brightly. "Casual clothes suit you. Makes this feel more like family." I kept my eyes steady as Karen took her seat beside me, and the APS worker settled silently near the armchair. 2 soldiers from my unit had arrived earlier under the pretense of dropping off something I forgot at the base. They now stood by the entryway, waiting to serve as neutral witnesses. Linda barely glanced at them. She assumed they were friends stopping by. When everyone was seated, Linda wasted no time. Her voice shifted into that dramatic tone she used whenever she wanted to appear noble. "If it were not for us, this house would have belonged to the bank years ago," she said. "We stepped in. We paid bills. We took care of everything while you were off doing whatever it is you do. Now that you want to take the house back, we need to talk about compensation for the years we held this place together." Tyler leaned forward, adding his own practiced bitterness. "Mom and I gave up so much to keep this home running. Most kids my age would be traveling or building their careers, but I stayed to watch over everything." His tone implied sacrifice. The footage I had collected showed something entirely different. Linda clasped her hands as if negotiating mercy. "So here is what we propose. You sign the property into the family trust, the new one, and in return, we will let you stay in your old room when you come back on leave. That way, everyone wins." Then came the insult she had been saving. "You go off doing government work somewhere," she said. "But your income is not enough to maintain a home like this. Do not fool yourself." My jaw tightened, but I breathed through the slow, familiar pattern I used during high-pressure briefings. One of the soldiers by the doorway cleared his throat softly. "Ma'am," he said, holding out a folder Karen had asked him to bring. Linda froze at the word. Her eyebrows pulled together in confusion. She stared at him as if he had mispronounced something. The soldier simply nodded at me with professional respect. But Linda still did not connect anything. In her mind, I was still the girl she mocked at 18. I leaned forward and picked up the remote. "Let us start with something simple," I said. The television blinked on. The first clip filled the screen. It was mild by comparison to what would follow. Linda instructing my grandmother to scrub the counter again, even though it was already clean. Grandma apologizing. Tyler walking past with a smirk. Linda waved dismissively. "That proves nothing. Everyone helps around the house." I pressed play again. The next clip showed her controlling the pill bottle, telling my grandmother she used too many pills and would have them taken away. Then footage of Tyler bumping the laundry basket into her chest, laughing, calling her slow. Then the call audio. If she finds out about the new trust, she will lose her mind. But she is too busy being a hero to bother reading anything. Linda shot up from her chair. This is fake. Edited. Cut to make us look bad. Karen opened her binder calmly and displayed the digital verification logs. Each timestamp matched the footage. Each clip was unaltered. Each piece followed chain of custody. APS stood and moved closer. We reviewed this material independently, the worker said. This is consistent with elder mistreatment and possible financial exploitation. Suddenly, Linda looked smaller. Tyler swallowed hard, glancing toward the door where the soldier stood, not threatening, but steady and observant. Karen placed the original will on the table. Here is the recorded document naming Jade as the owner at 25, she said. And here is the trustee expiration. And here is the form your mother was pressured to sign with incomplete explanation. The room shifted. The confidence that had filled Linda earlier drained like water through cracked stone. I could see her calculating, trying to piece together the moment where control slipped. My grandmother stood by the doorway, trembling, but watching every second. The APS worker stepped closer. Mrs. Evelyn has the right to safety and autonomy. What we saw today suggests that these rights were not respected. Linda looked from face to face, waiting for someone to defend her. No one did. I kept my voice low because the power was never in volume, but in clarity. You did not protect her, I said. So I will. Linda stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. Not the girl she thought she could override, but the woman sitting beside a lawyer, an APS investigator, and two soldiers who addressed her niece as ma'am. The world she curated inside this house had just shattered, and she realized it too late. This was only the first act of what she would face. The temporary protective order came through faster than I expected. Early Monday morning, Karen called to tell me the judge had reviewed the footage, the financial records, the APS report, and the will. His directive was simple and direct. Linda Stewart and Tyler Stewart were to vacate the premises immediately and remain off the property for the duration of the investigation. No negotiation. No slow transition. Just a firm legal line drawn where none had existed for far too long. 2 hours later, a sheriff's cruiser rolled quietly up the driveway. Not lights blazing, not dramatic, just the steady authority of someone doing a job that required calm rather than force. The sheriff stepped onto the porch and knocked. Linda opened the door smiling until she saw the badge. Her smile dissolved. Inside the house, my grandmother stood near the stairs, wringing her hands. The sheriff read the order aloud. Linda blinked rapidly, as if the words were too sharp to process. You have between 30 and 60 minutes to gather essential belongings, the sheriff said. You are not being arrested. You are simply required to leave the property until the court concludes its review. Tyler stomped out of the hallway. This is ridiculous. We kept this place running. She was never here. He jabbed a finger in my direction. Mom, tell him we are not leaving because some ungrateful soldier decided to throw us out. Linda's voice cracked as she shouted, She is throwing her own family onto the street! She should be ashamed! I stood still. The sheriff did not react. He had likely heard far worse in domestic orders. Linda kept yelling, ungrateful soldier, as if the phrase could wound me. After deployment and the things I had seen on operations, her words had no weight. My grandmother stepped closer to me, whispering, I never wanted this. I did not want to send them away. Her guilt was genuine, the kind born from decades of being conditioned to think survival was disloyalty. I placed a hand on her shoulder. You did not send anyone anywhere, Grandma. They chose this path when they treated you the way they did. She exhaled slowly, a tremor sliding out of her chest, like something long trapped. Meanwhile, Tyler slammed drawers and stuffed clothes into bags. Linda complained loudly to the sheriff that the house would fall apart without her, that I would drown in bills, that she was the real victim. Outside neighbors who had heard Linda's stories for years stepped onto their porches. They watched as Linda and Tyler carried boxes to their car. They heard her accusations that I was abandoning family. But they also heard the sheriff calmly mentioning elder exploitation as he explained the order. The narrative Linda had spun around the community began to crumble. A woman across the street, someone Linda often gossiped with, pulled her robe tighter and looked away, no longer willing to defend her friend. When Tyler shoved the last bag into the back seat, he shouted across the driveway, "We will sue you! Wait until you see what our lawyer does." Then he got into the car and slammed the door. The sheriff remained until they drove off, ensuring compliance. Once the car disappeared around the curve of the street, the house felt lighter. Not healed, not restored, but unburdened. My grandmother let out a sound halfway between a sigh and a sob. The space they had taken up in her life had been so constant, she had forgotten what silence felt like. I guided her inside and brewed hot tea, though my own hands shook slightly from the adrenaline crash. Over the next 48 hours, the first ripple of consequences hit Linda. The trust account she had been drawing from was frozen by court order, pending verification of authorized use. Her credit card stopped working. Charges bounced. Fees accumulated. She called Karen's office 3 times demanding explanations, but received none beyond the standard legal phrasing. Tyler received his own slap of reality. He applied for a truck loan at a local dealership, something he had planned for months, and was denied immediately when the lender ran a background check and saw an active investigation for financial misconduct tied to a protected senior. Word travels fast in small towns. The neighbors, who once believed he stayed home to care for his grandmother, now avoided eye contact. Reputation is its own currency, and theirs had plummeted. For my grandmother, the changes were gentler. We sorted her medication properly. We adjusted her room temperature to what she liked rather than what Linda preferred. For the first time in months, she sat on the couch with a blanket while I cooked, instead of standing in the kitchen waiting for permission to rest. In the middle of this quiet recovery, Karen forwarded me an email from Linda's attorney. The message was short and aggressive. They intended to countersue for defamation and damages, claiming the videos were misinterpreted and that I had irresponsibly accused them to seize the home. I read the email twice, then handed the phone to Karen, who raised an eyebrow. "They think bluster will scare you," she said. "It is a tactic, not an argument." I looked back at the screen and felt an unexpected calm settle across me. I had dealt with worse pressure in briefing rooms, where one mistake could cost soldiers their lives. A countersuit from 2 people who had never managed genuine responsibility in their entire adult lives did not intimidate me. "Good," I said softly. "That means they still do not understand who I really am." The next phase would show them. A few months passed before Linda tried to come back into my life, and for the first time in a long time, the house felt almost like it was breathing again. The chaos had drained out of the walls, the sheriff had done his job, the investigation was moving forward, and the constant edge in my shoulders had finally softened into something closer to watchful calm. I spent my mornings making coffee while my grandmother dozed in her recliner, the Rockies framed in the window behind her, like a painting that had been there long before any of us and would outlast all our drama. We had a part-time caregiver who came by 3 days a week, someone who spoke gently to her and asked permission before touching anything that belonged to her. I kept my phone on loud for work calls and for her doctors, and for a while, that was it. Then one Tuesday afternoon, between a secure briefing and a data call with Fort Carson, my personal phone lit up with a voicemail notification and an email from a name I thought I could ignore for a little longer. The subject line on the email was the same as the voicemail transcription that popped up on my screen. "Please call me, Jade. It is urgent. It is family." For a full minute, I just stared at her name. Stewart. The same last name that had been on my mailbox instead of mine. My thumb hovered over the delete button, then over the voicemail icon. I took a breath and listened. Her voice came through small and hoarse, stripped of the edge she used to slice me with. Jade, it is your Aunt Linda. Please, I need to talk to you. Things are bad. Tyler lost his job. The landlord is threatening to evict us. We have nowhere else to go. We are still family. Please, call me back. I could hear traffic in the background, some kind of cheap air conditioner rattling, her breath catching, like she was trying out a weaker version of the sobbing she used at the family meeting. I let the message end without moving, my hand tightening around the phone until my knuckles went white. For the first time since the hearing, I was not standing in court or recording abuse. I was just a woman whose body still remembered sitting at my parents' table, while this same voice laughed at the idea of me being anything more than a high school graduate in a uniform. I opened the email. It was longer, more controlled, the way she wrote when she wanted something and had rehearsed every word. She described how Tyler had been laid off, how his truck payment was behind, how credit card companies were calling. She blamed the economy, the bank, the sheriff, the judge, the neighbors, everyone but herself. In 3 short paragraphs, she spun a new story. She and Tyler as victims of an overreacting system. The house as a thing stolen from them instead of returned to its rightful owner. My grandmother as a confused old woman who had misunderstood everything. The last line hit the script she knew might still tug at me. We are still your family, Jade. Surely you do not want to see us on the street. There was a time when that line alone would have twisted a knife in me. I remembered being a teenager, listening to her cry about some bill and then feeling guilty that I got to go practice soccer while she worried. I remembered her hand gripping my arm at the funeral, telling me that if I did not let her handle things, the house would slip away. That was the old boy radar she counted on in people. The instinct to rush in and fix whatever someone crying in front of them said was broken. But the last few months had changed the wiring in my head. I had watched my grandmother flinch at the sound of her footsteps. I had listened to my own voice on recordings, steady and calm as I laid out evidence in front of APS and the court. I had reminded myself that sometimes the most dangerous people are the ones who know exactly how to sound helpless. I called Linda back anyway, not because she deserved it, but because I refused to be afraid of my own phone. She answered on the first ring, like she had been sitting there staring at it. Jade, thank God, she said, and she really did sound like she believed it. I kept my voice even. I heard your message. What is going on? She launched into the story again, this time with more color. Tyler had stormed out of one job, been fired from another. The apartment they were renting was too expensive. She could not find work that paid enough at her age. She dropped one more card on the table. We are looking at shelters, Jade. Shelters! After everything we did for this family. The guilt bait hung between us. I did not take it. I asked where she was. She suggested a coffee shop halfway between Boulder and her side of town. Neutral ground. Just the 2 of us, she said. No lawyers, no social workers. Just family. Talking. I could hear the hope in her voice when I agreed. The coffee shop was one of those places with old brick walls and black metal chairs. The kind of spot that tried a little too hard to look like it had been there since the 70s. I picked a table in the corner where I could see the door. Years of training had burned that habit into me. When she walked in, I almost did not recognize her. The woman who had strutted around my parents' house like it was a stage now looked smaller, edges frayed. Her hair roots were showing. The handbag on her arm was the same designer brand from before, but the strap was worn. When she saw me, she put on a smile that did not reach her eyes and hurried over. Jade, she said, and her voice broke on my name. She reached like she was going to hug me, then thought better of it when she saw my expression and sat down instead. For a few seconds, we just looked at each other. She started talking before I could. I know you are angry. I know things got out of hand. But we are in real trouble now. Tyler is trying, but nobody is hiring. The landlord, he does not care that we kept your house from being taken. We have nowhere to go. Her eyes filled with tears on cue. She dabbed at them with a napkin and leaned forward. You have connections, Jade. You have that uniform. You know people. If you could just help get Tyler into something, anything, on base maybe, or with one of your contacts, it would mean the world to us. Her pitch was simple. Use your rank. Make a call. Pull Tyler out of the hole he had been digging since the day he thought it was funny to send pictures of my grandmother carrying laundry with the caption, "Our free maid." She framed it as a chance for me to show that I was better than my anger, that I was mature enough to let the past stay in the past. Think of it as making things right, she said. After all, family is family. I let her talk. I watched her closely, the way I watched a feed in a dark operations room, not for weapons or hidden devices, but for something just as dangerous. Entitlement. It was still there under the tears, a hard little stone in the center of her performance. It was in the way she said, "your house," like it had always been hers. In the way she said, "we kept it," as if I had not been sending the money that paid the mortgage and taxes, while I was downrange making sure other families did not get a folded flag instead of a welcome home banner. When she finally ran out of words, I took a breath and answered. You are asking me to use my rank and my reputation to help someone who pushed my grandmother and laughed about it, I said quietly. You are asking me to call people who trust my judgment and tell them to give a job to a man who treated the owner of that house like a servant and treated her pain like a joke. That is not what I am asking, she protested, but her voice jumped just a little. I am just asking you to put in a good word. People do that all the time. It is how the world works. The problem is, I said, the world I live in has rules. In my world, you do not cover for people who hurt the vulnerable and steal from them. In my world, if I recommend someone, my word is on the line. I am not going to spend the trust I earned in uniform on shielding Tyler from consequences he created. Her face tightened, the tears drying as the old sharpness came back. So that is it. You would let your own aunt end up in a shelter. You would rather see us punished than see us helped. I did not flinch. I am not the one who put you in this position, I said. You did that when you turned my parents' house into a place my grandmother was afraid to breathe in. You did that when you used her credit to pay for your lifestyle and called it sacrifice. You did that when you taught your son that she was a maid instead of a human being. What I can do is point you to resources that are meant for situations like this. I took a folded paper out of my folder and slid it across the table. It was a list I had printed that morning after talking to our elder law attorney and a social worker. Shelters that took older women, legal aid clinics, a workforce center, churches that ran food banks. Linda stared at it like I had handed her a summons. This is what you offer, she whispered. After everything. I nodded. I am not going to let you back into that house. I am not going to pay your bills. I am not going to pretend what you did not happen so you can feel comfortable. But I am not going to block any path you choose to walk that does not go through her living room. That is my line. For a long moment she was silent. The coffee around us hissed and steamed. Someone laughed at another table. Finally, she looked up, eyes bright with more anger than grief. So with you, what is family, really? Just whoever you decide is convenient? The question hung in the air between us like smoke. I thought of my grandmother kneeling on marble, apologizing for her own blood on the floor. I thought of my parents buying that house to be a haven, not a prison. I thought of the soldiers who had sat beside me in desert tents, sharing stories about kids and parents and spouses, about the people they would die for, and the people they had had to walk away from to stay sane. Family, I said slowly, is where the oldest person in the room gets a chair and a plate before anyone else. It is where no one is afraid to take their medicine. It is where the person who owns the house is respected, not exploited. Right now, in my life, that means my grandmother. That is my family. Linda stared at me like she was seeing a stranger, and maybe she was. The version of me she had known would have bent, would have tried to fix it for her, and carried the guilt for years. The woman sitting across from her now had spent too many nights making impossible calls to confuse cruelty with obligation. She pushed her chair back, the legs scraping hard across the floor. "You will regret this," she said under her breath. "Maybe not today, but one day." She snatched up the paper, crumpling it a little, and walked out without looking back. I watched her go and felt a strange mix of sadness and relief wash through me. A chapter was closing. The cost had been high, but it was not mine to pay this time. On the drive home, I glanced at the picture of my grandmother that hung from my rearview mirror, a small snapshot of her in the garden from years ago, and I knew I had done the only thing that lined up with the woman in that photo and the soldier I had become. I did not need my rank to prove that to Linda. I only needed my boundaries. A few quiet months passed after the hearing, and life in the Boulder house finally began to feel like something close to normal again. The place no longer carried the tension that had soaked into the walls when Linda and Tyler lived there. My grandmother settled into a gentle routine with the caregiver who visited several times a week, someone who spoke kindly and never raised her voice. I finished repainting 2 of the rooms that had been neglected, repaired some plumbing, replaced the broken blinds, and installed new security locks that only the 2 of us had codes for. There were still hospital follow-up appointments, still paperwork from APS and the court, still the faint hesitation in my grandmother's eyes whenever someone unexpected knocked on the door. But the air had cleared. She smiled more. She laughed again. Sometimes in the evenings, she would sit by the window with a blanket on her lap and say that the house finally felt like it remembered who it belonged to. Then one afternoon, between a call with Fort Carson and a training review for an intel rotation I had been recommended for, my phone lit up with both a voicemail and an email from a name I had hoped would stay silent longer. Linda Stewart. The subject line said simply, "Please call me. It is important." I listened to the voicemail first. Her voice was nothing like the sharp tone she used at the house or in the courthouse hallway. It was thin, shaky, almost unrecognizable. "Jade, it is your Aunt Linda," she said, breathing hard, as if she had been crying or walking fast. "Please, I know things ended badly, but I need to talk to you. Tyler lost his job. We are behind on rent. The landlord is threatening eviction. We do not have anywhere to go. You are the only family we have left. Please call me back." I stared at the screen for several seconds. I had spent months watching her treat my grandmother as an inconvenience. Months collecting footage of her controlling medication, belittling her in front of neighbors, spending her money without permission. Now she expected sympathy, because the world she had built on someone else's suffering had finally collapsed. I opened the email. It was longer, more polished, the way she wrote when she wanted something. She explained again that Tyler could not find stable work, that bills had piled up, that she had tried everything, but nothing had worked. She said that she was not asking for money, only guidance, only a chance to talk. She wrote that she wanted the family to heal, that she regretted how tense things had become, that she hoped we could start over. It ended with a line clearly designed to trigger old habits in me. "We are still your family, Jade. Surely you do not want us to be without a home." I read it twice, then a third time, and realized that the guilt she expected to sweep over me was replaced by a strange calm. That was the difference between who I had been before the deployment and who I was now. I called her back, because avoiding her would give her more emotional power than she deserved. She answered before the second ring. "Jade, thank God," she said, as if I had come to rescue her. She asked if we could meet, just the two of us. No lawyers, no APS. A chance to speak honestly. I agreed to meet her at a cafe halfway across town. Neutral ground. She arrived 10 minutes late, walking in with the hesitant steps of someone trying to look smaller than they felt. The woman who had once tried to control every inch of my parents' home now looked worn down, as if the last few months had stripped the shine off her. She sat down and immediately began crying. Not loud, but soft, practiced tears. She talked about the economy, about unfair bosses, about landlords who did not understand her situation. She painted herself and her son as victims of circumstance, rather than architects of their own choices. Then she leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Jade, if you could help just a little, everything would change. You have connections in the Army. You could help Tyler get a job somewhere stable, even something small on base, something to get him back on his feet. If you could do that, we could all move past what happened. It would mean we could be a family again." That was the moment the old script revealed itself. Not remorse, not accountability, just strategy. She did not want healing. She wanted access. Access to my rank, my reputation, my network. I let her finish before I spoke. I kept my voice steady. "Linda," I said, "I am not sure you understand what I do. I have participated in decisions that stopped attacks. I have received direct commendations from senior command. I am being considered for a position in an intelligence agency in Washington. I cannot and will not use the trust people place in me to cover for someone who shoved my grandmother and laughed about it, or for someone who spent her money and called it sacrifice." Her face froze. She had not expected that. For years, she had treated me as if the Army was something simple, something she could reduce to a pay stub and a camouflage shirt. She never imagined that the woman she dismissed so casually could have influence that reached far beyond Boulder. I continued. "I will not use my position to help Tyler avoid consequences he earned. And I will not open any door that puts my grandmother at risk again. The only thing I can offer is a list of shelters, legal aid services, and community programs that might help you. Nothing more." I slid a small folded paper across the table. She stared at it as if it were an insult. After a long silence, her voice broke into something sharp and brittle. "So that is it. You would turn your back on your own family." I looked her in the eyes. Family is where the oldest person in the room gets a chair at the table, not a list of chores. Family is where no one is afraid to take their medicine. Family is where the people who built the home are treated with respect, not used until they break. Right now, my family is my grandmother. That is enough. She inhaled sharply, wounded more by the truth than by the circumstances she had created. She gathered her purse, stood up, and left without saying goodbye. I watched her disappear through the door, the bell above it ringing faintly, and felt no satisfaction, only clarity. The path back for her had closed, not with anger, not with revenge, just with the quiet weight of a boundary she never thought I would enforce. The first morning after the conversation with Linda felt strangely quiet, as if the house itself had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. Sunlight slid across the hardwood floors, warming the air. My grandmother sat by the window with a cup of chamomile tea between her palms, watching the Rockies glow pink in the early light. I moved around the kitchen preparing breakfast, scrambled eggs with herbs she liked, bacon cooked until just crisp. The television played softly in the background. A news anchor spoke about a recent security operation overseas, something strategically important. They did not mention names, but I recognized the language, the phrasing, the shadow of an operation I had contributed analysis for months earlier. It was a reminder that even while I rebuilt this home, pieces of me were still tied to larger responsibilities. But those responsibilities no longer pulled me away for years at a time. I had accepted a stateside assignment near Denver and Fort Carson, a role focused on intelligence review and data architecture, not deployment. It allowed me to stay close, to watch over my grandmother as she healed, and to rebuild the life that had been allowed to crumble in my absence. When I carried breakfast to the table, she smiled in a way that reached her eyes, a rare softness replacing the guarded look she had worn for too long. "This house is becoming warm again," she whispered. "It has been cold for years." I squeezed her shoulder gently. "It will never be cold like that again." As the weeks passed, our routines settled. I replaced old locks, repaired the roof shingles damaged in a storm, replanted the garden she once tended with my mother. I still worked long hours, but the kind of long hours that ended with me sleeping in my own bed, rather than a cot on a distant base. Slowly, I allowed myself to breathe. And as I breathed, I noticed others who had not yet found room to do the same. Boulder had seen an increase in elder abuse reports, particularly financial exploitation disguised as family caretaking. I recognized the patterns too easily. I contacted a local nonprofit that supported victims of elder mistreatment and offered what I could contribute. I did not give them details about my grandmother, but I shared the structure of our case, the warning signs, the shifted power dynamics, the subtle erosion of autonomy, and how easily the lines blurred when family was involved. They listened closely. One of the directors told me that understanding the problem from both a military intelligence perspective and a personal one made my insight uniquely useful. I volunteered to help with training modules, showing staff how to identify behavioral patterns hidden behind polite smiles and rehearsed narratives. Each time I spoke, I thought of my grandmother hiding her pain behind apologies. On some weekends, a small group of elderly veterans from the nonprofit visited our home. My grandmother cooked for them willingly, laughing at their stories, offering advice, listening to their frustrations. She was not serving them the way she had been forced to serve Linda and Tyler. She was hosting them, honoring them. And for the first time in a long while, she seemed proud of her own home again. The house itself transformed. What had once been a place where control and fear were enforced now became a quiet refuge. The large living room with high ceilings that Linda once filled with expensive decorations now held open space for conversations and shared meals. The guest room Tyler claimed as his future office was turned into a reading room for my grandmother, lined with the books she had been too tired to enjoy before. Sometimes in the evenings, I would find her sitting there with a novel on her lap, humming softly, no tension in her shoulders. One afternoon, the elder support group held a small gathering in our backyard. A few caregivers, a couple of veterans, and a woman who had recently left an abusive household gathered around a picnic table. My grandmother brought out lemonade. People talked about healing, about boundaries, about starting over. As the event wound down, an older man with a stiff gait approached me. His hair was white, his frame lean, and he walked with the deliberate balance of someone who had once marched long distances with weight on his back. He thanked me for speaking to the group earlier and asked what had been hardest for me in all of this. I hesitated, thinking he meant the legal process or the emotional exhaustion. He shook his head gently. "No," he said. "I mean the fight itself. What was harder, analyzing a battlefield or confronting your own blood?" I let out a quiet breath, surprised by how quickly the answer came. "On the battlefield, there are rules of engagement," I said. "Expectations, protocols. Every move has a framework. But with family, there are no formal rules. Only the boundaries you draw and defend." He nodded knowingly, as if that answer settled something in him. When he walked away, my grandmother slipped her arm through mine. She had heard the exchange. "I am glad you drew those boundaries," she said, "for both of us." And for the first time since returning home, I realized I was finally living not in reaction to trauma, but in the space beyond it. A space where the home my parents had left me was becoming not a battleground, but a legacy. A legacy that would extend to the people who walked through its doors seeking rest or hope. A legacy that my grandmother and I were finally rebuilding together. The sun dipped behind the mountains as the last guests left. The house glowed with the warm light of evening, calm and steady. And for the first time in years, it truly felt like ours. I sat on the front steps of the house as the sun lowered itself behind the Rockies, painting the sky in tones of gold and soft red. The stone beneath me was warm from the afternoon heat, and the gentle quiet of early evening wrapped around the property like a blanket. Inside, my grandmother was asleep in her recliner, the kind of deep midday nap she had not enjoyed in years, when fear and tension had filled every corner of this home. Out here, with the wind brushing lightly across the yard, I finally allowed myself to exhale. For the first time since returning from deployment, I was not assessing threats or anticipating the next escalation. I was simply sitting, present, letting the weight of everything settle. It struck me how far we had come, how far I had come. I thought back to the moment I first opened the door and saw my grandmother kneeling on the marble floor, apologizing for bleeding onto it. That image had carved itself into my nerves like a scar. In combat zones, you learn very quickly that you cannot save everyone. You learn to prioritize, to act fast, to protect those who cannot protect themselves. But no training prepared me for the realization that the person who needed saving was in my own home. The battlefield had taught me skills, but this house taught me something deeper. Sometimes the most dangerous wounds are not caused by enemies, but by people who use the word family as a shield for their greed. People who convince themselves their entitlement is sacrifice. People who hide behind the language of caretaking while draining the life out of the very person they claim to protect. I had dealt with insurgents, with hostile informants, with shifting intelligence. None of it prepared me for the subtle cruelty of watching my grandmother be turned into a servant in the house my parents worked their entire lives to build. I had been trained to defend my country, but this was the moment I learned to defend my own blood from those who shared that blood. As the sun dipped lower, I thought about the quiet transformation inside the house. My grandmother no longer walked on eggshells. She no longer apologized for existing. She laughed again, cooked because she wanted to, rested when she needed to. The difference was not only visible, it was in the air. It was in the way the walls seemed lighter, the way the floors no longer echoed with tension. Healing had its own sound. I also thought about the people who might be listening to this story, especially those who were older. If you are listening and you are in your 60s or 70s or 80s, let me say this clearly. You are not a burden. You are not meant to earn the right to stay in your own home. You are not required to trade comfort or dignity for the illusion of family harmony. You have the right to say no. And if you are the adult child or grandchild watching this, let me tell you something else. Staying silent about abuse is not loyalty. It is abandonment. Turning away is not protecting family unity. It is allowing harm to continue because it is easier than confronting it. And if you have ever been called ungrateful or dramatic because you defended yourself or defended someone vulnerable, then hear me. You are not alone. The people shouting ungrateful often depend on your silence to maintain their power. Sitting on the steps, I reflected on the strange double life I carried. The audience now knew the truth my relatives never did. I had earned levels of clearance and trust that very few officers my age ever reached. I had been part of operations that shifted outcomes of conflicts, even if my name would never appear anywhere. A federal-level intelligence office had reached out about a temporary assignment that might place me in Washington, but I had turned it down for now. Not because I lacked ambition, not because the opportunity was not extraordinary, but because this house needed reconstruction from the inside out. Because my grandmother needed protection after years of carrying burdens quietly. Because some missions are not written into military orders. Some missions rise in your chest the moment you see someone you love kneeling on a cold floor, apologizing for things that should never have happened. Power means nothing if it is used to elevate yourself at the cost of the people who shaped you. Real power is choosing to protect the right people, even when no one is watching. I let the breeze cool my face as the last light faded. A question formed in my mind, one that I now offer to anyone listening. What part of this story struck you the hardest? Was it the moment my grandmother wiped her own blood from the floor? Or was it the moment Linda, who had created the pain, returned months later and asked for help as if history no longer existed? Which one hurt more? And then I ask you this. If you were in my position, would you let them back into your home? Would you open the door again? Your answers say something about the boundaries you choose to hold in your own life. If this story reminded you of something you have lived through, or something you fear might happen to someone you love, share your experience below. Others might need to read it. If you want to continue exploring how ordinary households can become battlegrounds for dignity, justice, and survival, watch the next story. And if you want to make sure you never miss these stories, the ones that might be your neighbor's stories, or your parents' stories, or someday even your own, subscribe so you stay with us for what comes next.